provided the means for them to worship him appropriately for what he has done. We see also the hearing of the people. That phrase kind of caught me off guard because it's not how I speak, so I looked it up in a couple other translations. Hearing or speaking to the ears of the people. This is actually the first time in the entire narrative, when I actually started looking at it, this is the first time in the narrative where Moses actually intentionally communicates with the people of Israel. This whole time he's been doing things on behalf of the people of Israel, but this is the first time he goes and communicates to the people of Israel to go do something. And then every man and every woman ask of their neighbor. I was like, that's interesting, because they're in the land of Goshen. How my mind worked, that's slave land. So why would you go ask your neighbor for gold or silver? Because they're slaves with you, so they probably don't have any. Upon further research, I realized they lived in Goshen, obviously, but they lived among a native Egyptian people called the Semites. So they were actually living with Egyptians in the land of Goshen, yes, as slaves, but that's why they could go and ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor for gold and silver, because they were Egyptians and they actually did have wealth. 11:3. It's just the fulfillment of God's promises to Moses at the burning bush. And for a cross-reference, you can go look at Exodus 3:12 and 21 and 22. That's really where that promise is instituted to Moses and God. We also see in verse 3 that Moses is described as being very great. He's very great because he was held in fearful awe by the Egyptians. The Egyptians, up until this point, by association, have suffered under Moses' hand. Every time he raises his staff or does something, hail, locusts, plagues, these people are struggling because of that. So he was held in a fearful awe among the native Egyptians. Then moving on to 11:4, the phrase "about midnight eye." It was something I noticed. Every plague prior, Moses and Aaron were God's vessels. They kind of did God's bidding. Each plague prior required some action by them in some sense. The last plague, God carried out himself. Exodus 4:23. In looking at this plague, I'm looking at my Bible and there's a little cross references and everything. So I went back to Exodus 4:23, and in Exodus 4:23, it was actually the first plague threatened. This 10th plague was actually the first plague threatened. God said, "I will kill Pharaoh's firstborn if he does not let your people go." And then 9 plagues later, here he is saying, "I'm going to kill the firstborn of Egypt." Initially, that kind of caught me off guard. Why would God bring 9 plagues prior to judge the nation of Egypt? Then the Lord, in reading and just trying to gather context, reminded me of Exodus 12:38, where it says, "a multitude of people." I looked up multitude. It's not a multitude like in size. It's a multitude in, well, I guess it could be size as well, but it was a multitude, meaning different kinds of people. It was not just Israelites. And I realized the prior 9 plagues was an act of mercy by God. And I know that seems like kind of a reach, but the prior 9 plagues brought more people in the land of Egypt to respond in obedient faith. Our God, while being just, while being wrathful towards sin and rebellion, simultaneously was merciful and long-suffering. The 9 plagues elevated God's character. The 9 plagues showed who God was in his fullness. He wasn't just wrathful. He wasn't just. He was also merciful, patient, and long-suffering. And then, of course, the thought goes, because I'm a New Testament believer, meaning I'm not living in that time, is a foreshadowing of the Gentiles being brought into God's people. God's heart to reconcile mankind to right relationship with him. So verse 4 kind of blew me away. 11:5, it says, plague will be carried out in all the land of Egypt. Whereas prior, there was a distinction between Egypt and the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen, the hail would not fall, the locust would not attack. All of those prior 9 plagues, the land of Goshen was secluded from the plague. Then you come here and it says, the plague was declared over all the land of Egypt. And it was, again in context, condemnation for all who were not found under the blood of the Lamb. A plague over all of Egypt, over, in analogy, all mankind. 11:6 and 7, clear distinction made between those who were God's people and those who are not. It says not a dog will growl or bark at like beast or man that is included in my people. We see 11:8, hot anger. Moses is greatly respected by the Jews and Egyptians alike. And we see him respond to Pharaoh's hardness of heart in hot anger. And it made me go, well, why? He kind of should have expected it. God even tells him, Pharaoh's going to harden your heart and he won't let your people go. And yet Moses still responds in hot anger. Why? Because he knew the condemnation that one man's choice brought on an entire nation. Does this sound familiar? By one man's choice, all are condemned? Those were just questions I asked myself. 11:9, all of this was for the purpose of glorifying God and making his sovereignty and character known throughout the land of Egypt and to his people, and bringing his people to freedom or reconciliation. In 11:10, Pharaoh's heart was hardened by God. Like JT talked in Exodus 9:17, Pharaoh exalted himself. That reminded me of Romans 18 through 21, really just a process of the hardening of a man's heart. And I'll just read it because it's on my notes. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness oppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And observation, sounds a lot like Pharaoh. So, either way, that was my exegesis of the scripture, the intentional examination and interpretation of what I had seen. Now, in my process, I said, okay, Lord, teach me about you. Teach me about your character and show me. Reveal yourself to me in your word so that I can know you better. And he taught me 4 main things, 4 main truths. And so that's where we're gonna engage this morning. I have the privilege of sharing those with you all. One thing I would like to do in that sharing is he taught me the main truth in Exodus, but then I want to also take that and put it in New Testament context, right? Because we're not Israelites living in Egypt. We're believers living in this world. So I would like to do an Old Testament and New Testament comparison, and we're just going to walk through that together. The first truth that he showed me was the people who need salvation are slaves. Israelites were slaves under a cruel tyrant king, a man who claimed or desired deity and oppressed God's people. When Moses confronted him to let his people go, let God's people go, he responded with a prideful and hard heart. And he oppressed them all the more, exercising his perceived power or authority. As I thought about that, I go, Israel's condition as slaves under a cruel tyrant king is the literal condition of all mankind. It's the literal human condition. All are born into slavery, to sin, and captive under Satan's domain of darkness. Some references you can look at are Colossians 1:13, 2 Timothy 2:25 and 26. We are unable to change our conditions in and of ourselves from the bondage that we experience. So our just, sovereign, and merciful God intervened. Even if we could meet our quotas, which we can't, we are still incapable to set ourselves free from our current situation. Apart from the person of Christ, we, by our own ability, are and will continue to be slaves to sin. And because of that, the penalty for rejecting God's means of salvation is death. 11:5, we see condemnation of all who were not found under the blood of the Lamb, the firstborn in all the land. That constitutes that it included the Israelites. Though it didn't exempt them, they were the only ones given the instruction on how to be excluded from this plague. I said, New Testament. There's a couple Old Testament passages in here, but we've got Proverbs 2:29. Who can say, I have made my heart pure, I am free from sin. Ecclesiastes 7:20. Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Romans 23, for all of the glory of God. Church, the verdict has been given. Mankind is guilty. We were born in Adam, and without being transferred from one kingdom to another, we will receive the condemnation, the wrath that comes because we are not in his people. But like I said, God, in his mercy, in his love, and in his kindness toward mankind, intervened. What does that intervention look like? The provision for God's means of salvation is through the blood of an acceptable blood sacrifice. This is where I have to apologize to JT a little bit because I skipped ahead. So I'm going to do my best to not steal his thunder for next week, but my goodness, it's good stuff. I looked up, and reading, the Passover and all of that, continuing past chapter 11. Passover. How do you generally think of it? We generally think of it as the angel of death passing over, right? That because they painted the blood on the lintel and the doorpost, he goes, oh, okay, not that house, not that one. Oh, there we go, that one. Get the firstborn there. I was like, of course, I have to do my research, right? Passover actually, when observed by Messianic Jews, the Passover, the blood on the lintel and the doorpost was not to keep God out, but an invitation to pass over the threshold and protect from within. That God would protect them from himself. I also looked up Hebrew, because that word is used a lot. Hebrew, the definition of a Hebrew is one who Passover. Who were once but how do we accept Christ, right? How were the Israel, or the people of God, how were they passed over? The application of God's means of salvation is through obedient faith. Exodus 11, 2 and 3, and stick with me. It's going to kind of seem like a little bit of jumping around, but the provision of worship of the Lord post-Exodus from Egypt. Moses tells the people, whisper in their ears, speak to them, tell them to go ask their neighbors for gold and silver. Why? When you read through the book of Exodus, you see the institution of how to worship God appropriately. He set the temple, a place where he could live on earth until the time of Christ, a place where he came and dwelt among his people, those who had been reconciled to him. But there's obviously stipulations, right? God had them build a temple. He had them build everything to his specific requirements, that this is what I will live in, and this is what it needs to be made of, and this is how it needs to be made. He act of reconciliation that he has set them free in. He provided the sacrifices that they got to bring their livestock along. They're not just in the middle of the desert going, well, I guess it's going to be a snake today. No. He allowed them to leave with their livestock, with the riches, with the gold, the silver, the jewels, with the linens to make the robes. He allowed his people to worship him appropriately. So I was like, wow, that's amazing. But then I realized something, and I was actually talking to my father over there, who pretty incredible man from my perspective. So we're talking about this, and I'm kind of working through all of that with him, and he goes, just dawned on me. Religion worships to be set free. Religion goes through the formalities and all of the stuff with the hope of being recognized as being set free from something. Faith is set free to worship. Notice that God provided the means for them to worship after, by faith, they walked out of Egypt. After he had already provided a way for them, he provided a way for them to worship him appropriately. And I went, that's incredible. Reminds me of 2 Peter 1, 3-4. His divine power has granted us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted us to his precious and very great promises, so that through them because of sin